Oshawa's down a shift, and the Ingersoll, the CAMI plant. GM already shut down its electric van line back in the fall. Over 1,000 more jobs folded into the very same clawback.
We're bleeding jobs. We're bleeding investment. The auto industry is under severe attack at the moment.
Canada is watching General Motors shut down production, cut shifts, and move more work towards the United States. And the anger is starting to boil over. In Oshawa, hundreds of workers are losing their jobs. In Ingersoll, an entire electric van program has been terminated. These were not forgotten factories. Governments poured hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars into keeping them alive, and Canadians were told those investments would protect.
Well, the day that auto workers in Oshawa, Ontario have dreaded for months is nearly here. General Motors is cutting a shift at the city's plant as the company continues to scale back its Canadian operations.
Now the reality looks completely different. GM reduced Oshawa from 3 shifts to 2, eliminating roughly 500 direct jobs, while Uniform warned that the total damage across suppliers could reach around 1,200 workers. Around the same time, the same Silverado built in Oshawa was also being produced in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where GM added workers. Same truck, same company, completely different direction for employment.
GM told the workers in Oshawa third shift was gone, about 500 people off the line, and by the union's count, up to 1,200 more across the parts suppliers that feed the plant. That same stretch of weeks, the exact truck those workers build, the Chevy Silverado, GM was quietly adding people to build down in Fort Wayne, Indiana.
GM says the Oshawa decision reflects demand returning to more normal levels after the pandemic truck boom. And that point matters. The company has not claimed that every Canadian job disappeared because of tariffs or politics, but try explaining that distinction to a worker walking out of the plant after losing a shift while a production capacity is increasing south of the border. Corporate explanations do not make a mortgage payment.
The CAMI Ingersoll plant in southwestern Ontario, ending production of the Bright Drop electric van, after the company said they hadn't seen the needed demand, leaving over 1,100 workers.
The deeper problem is that Oshawa is the only one piece of the story. In Ingersoll, GM pulled the plug on Bright Drop electric van production at the CAMI plant. More than 1,000 workers were affected. This was a facility politicians once presented as a proof that Canada could become a major player in the electric vehicle industry. Less than 3 years later, the production line went quiet.
The auto sector is being hard hit right now. In Ingersoll, Ontario, for example, near London in the southwest part of the province, GM is also closing a plant there. That's the plant where they had been making electric delivery trucks. Production ceased a while ago there. They were supposed to reopen that plant in the fall and then announced they would not be reopening. So layoffs there.
GM says the demand simply was not there. The commercial electric van market did not develop as expected. Orders were weak, and the company decided it could no longer justify production. That is important because Bright Drop production was not simply packed onto trucks and moved directly to an American factory. The program itself failed to generate enough demand. But for Canadian workers, the result is still a silent factory.
Melanie Jolly went on CBC and said she'd met with GM and told them flat out Canada would be getting its money back. Millions, justice for taxpayers, who, in her words, have no time for those who don't believe in us.
What makes the situation harder to accept is how much public money was already involved. Ottawa and Ontario each committed up to hundreds of millions of dollars towards GM facilities in Oshawa and Ingersoll, with governments promoting those investments as a way to secure thousands of Canadian jobs. Now Ottawa is talking about clawing back money after a shift disappeared in Oshawa and Bright Drop production ended in Ingersoll.
The future of that plant uncertain. Similarly, in Brampton, Stellantis had been planning on making a Jeep at that plant. Now they're making it in the United States instead. A lot of frustration, I can tell you here, Hillary, on behalf of the union leaders who represent the auto workers in Oshawa. They blame GM for this decision and say they're making business decisions to appease U.S. President.
That is the part people are furious about. Taxpayers were told that the subsidies were buying security. Workers were told public investments would protect Canadian manufacturing. Communities planned around those promises. Then the jobs disappeared anyway. The government ministers were left talking about recovering millions after the factories had already changed direction. A refund does not reopen a production line. A lawsuit does not restore a shift.
because there's another number from this same winter that makes the clawback look like pocket change. And it's got Ottawa's own signature on it. Remember that second number I said Ottawa wasn't putting next to the clawback headline? This is it. It's got the Prime Minister's own name on it. Here's the setup, because you need it to feel how this lands. This same winter, while the Oshawa story is playing out at home.
Ontario's auto towns understand this better than anyone. When 500 assembly jobs disappear, the damage does not stop at the factory gate. Pair suppliers lose orders, trucking companies move less freight, restaurants lose customers, local businesses lose spending, municipal tax revenue weakens. One assembly job can support several other jobs around it, which is why Unifor's estimate of the wider Oshawa impact is much larger than GM's direct layoff number.
We're hearing from the union that other companies are preparing to lay off or already have their employees as well because of the production cut here at the GM plant. So difficult days ahead here in Oshawa, a lot of uncertainty for auto workers here, but that same uncertainty is also being felt by auto workers in other parts of the province.
And then there is Stellantis, because what happened in Brampton makes a GM story look like a part of something much bigger. Around 3,000 workers were left waiting after production plans for the Brampton plant were abandoned. Jeep Compass production that had been expected in Ontario was instead assigned to Belvedere, Illinois, as a part of Stellantis' enormous new investment push into the United States.
Lawsuits also an option with Stellantis, who moved production of the Jeep Compass from Brampton to Illinois last week.
Stellantis had an obligation to bring back the production to the Brampton plant, and they failed that obligation. And so that's why we're putting maximum pressure on the company.
Stellantis announced a $13 billion U.S. manufacturing investment, including the reopening of the Illinois facility. Canada has already committed substantial public support to Stellantis operations here. Ottawa believed that money would help secure Canadian jobs. Instead, Canadian officials eventually found themselves issuing default notices and threatening to recover funds after production plans had already moved south.
It's still putting $280 million in the next pickup at Oshawa, and has sunk more than $2.6 billion into Canadian plants over 5 years. That's real, and you shouldn't know it. But you don't have to take a side to see the shape of this. Doug Ford's nobody's idea of a Carney ally went straight at the Prime Minister and said Ottawa has to get competitive and scrap the EV mandate or watch more of this happen.
That is why Canadians are not looking at Oshawa, Ingersoll, and Brampton as three completely separate stories anymore. One company reduced Canadian shifts while hiring in Indiana. Another ends a taxpayers-backed EV program. Another redirects promised production towards Illinois while investing billions in American manufacturing. The details are different, but the direction keeps looking the same. More uncertainty in Canada, more certainty in the United States.
On one side, Ottawa chasing GM for a few million after the Oshawa shift is already gone. The other, the door held open for tens of thousands of Chinese EVs a year. And here's the thing that should bother you no matter who you vote for. Either of those moves puts one single worker back on the line in Oshawa, not one.
Ottawa responded by cutting tariff-free import quotas for GM and Stellantis, describing the move as leverage. GM's quota was reduced by roughly a quarter, while Stellantis was hit even harder. The government wanted to make access to the Canadian market conditional on maintaining Canadian production. On paper, that sounds tough. In practice, much of the production damage had already happened before Ottawa reached for that weapon.
But anytime you have a layoff like this, it's obviously devastating for the workers that are impacted, and it does undermine the Canadian auto manufacturing sector in total, for sure.
The Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association criticized that approach as an unforced error. The argument is simple. If companies are already questioning whether Canada remains competitive, making it more expensive to operate here may not convince them to stay. It may simply give executives another reason to place the next production line in Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, or Illinois instead of Ontario. And Canada is operating from an extremely vulnerable position because its auto industry was built around access to the United States. An industry representative put the problem plainly. Canadian manufacturing plants depend on being able to sell into the American market. Canada alone does not have the population base to support huge assembly operations producing hundreds of thousands of vehicles every year.
What support is being provided for these impacted workers?
Well, the union says they will continue to fight for these workers, continue to advocate for them. They're setting up an action center where they will offer training to the laid off workers to upgrade some skills, help them with their job search.
That is the structural weakness behind every GM headline. Roughly 90% of vehicles built in Canada are exported to the United States according to the supplied material. Canadian plants are not primarily producing cars for Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, and Calgary. They are producing for North American market, where the largest customer sits directly across the border. When tariff-free access disappears, the economics change immediately. A vehicle assembled in Ontario must compete against one assembled in an American plant that does not face the same border cost. A company planning its next billion-dollar investment has to ask an obvious question. Why accept political uncertainty, tariffs, and cross-border risks in Canada if the same factory can be built closer to Americans' consumers?
Last May, the GM announced that it would be cutting the third shift at this plant. Initially, these job cuts were supposed to take effect in November, but then that was postponed until now. At the time when GM made this announcement, they said it was due to forecasted demand and the evolving trade environment.
That is exactly why the trade dispute matters, even when GM says a specific layoff was not directly caused by tariffs. The trade war did not create every problem, but it changes every future investment calculation. Weak demand might kill one van. A shift might disappear because truck demand normalizes. But long-term uncertainty over American market access determines whether the next product gets assigned to Ontario at all.
From the union is that more senior workers at the plant on that third shift will be able to keep their jobs. They'll be moved to the two remaining shifts, and more junior workers with less seniority, they will be the ones that are essentially bumped out of their jobs and will be losing their jobs.
GM's Ingersoll decision makes that danger obvious. The plant previously built the Equinox. After Bright Drop production ended, GM said it would search for another vehicle for the facility, but Canadian workers do not have a guaranteed replacement today. Meanwhile, additional production has been announced at American plants. Every month without a replacement makes people wonder whether CAMI will ever return to the scale it once had.
A broader MOU that was signed between South Korea and Canada, and the focus of that MOU is on areas related to the energy transition, critical minerals, clean tech in general.
Ottawa is trying to find replacements elsewhere. Canada has signed a broader memorandum of understanding with South Korea involving critical minerals, batteries, clean technology, and potentially vehicle manufacturing. In theory, that could eventually bring Korean automotive investment into Canada. But even industry experts immediately point back to the same problem. Any new plant in Canada would still need reliable access to the US market.
EV production are part of that, but they're one element of certainly a broader MOU between the two countries to take advantage of the relationship that currently exists. And I think
that means Korea cannot simply rescue Ontario from the consequences of a broken North American trade relationship. Hyundai, Kia, or any other global automaker would look at exactly the same numbers GM sees. Canada offers skilled workers, existing suppliers, infrastructure, energy, and proximity to the United States. But the proximity becomes less valuable if vehicles crossing that border suddenly face expensive tariffs.
While the federal government and Ontario may fight the automakers in court, without a tariff resolution, more plants are likely to slash shifts and production or close altogether.
All these companies are facing this unprecedented tariff challenge from the White House.
This is why the upcoming USMCA review matters so much. It's not another boring trade meeting that only lawyers and bureaucrats should care about. The agreement determines the basic economic logic behind Canadian automotive manufacturing. If companies believe tariff-free access will remain secure, Ontario remains attractive. If executives believe that the rules can change every few months, investment naturally starts moving toward the safer side of the border.
GM says it's about 500 jobs directly at the plant that are being cut. The union representing auto workers in the city of Oshawa says many more jobs beyond that will also be impacted because of this shift cut, and that is because of the supply chain in the city of Ottawa. This city's economy is heavily reliant on the auto sector.
The warning signs are already visible. Canadian auto production has fallen dramatically from where it stood a decade ago. Plants that once represented long-term industrial stability now spend years waiting for retooling, announcements, subsidies, new mandates, or trade negotiations. Communities are being asked to believe that another government program will protect them. Even after previous promises ended with fewer shifts and empty production lines, look at what happens to a town when confidence disappears. Oshawa has generations of families connected to General Motors. Ingersoll built its local economy around Cami. Brampton expected thousands of workers to return when Stellantis finished retooling. These places do not replace assembly plants with a few office jobs. When manufacturing disappears, workers sometimes have to leave the community entirely to just find comparable wages.
If we wait it out and think, well, if we can just get through to 2029 when there's a new administration and maybe things will be different, we may not have anything left to save.
Ingersoll used to make the popular GM Equinox, but instead of returning that to Canada, Donna, GM has announced they're adding additional production in Kansas.
The effect spreads into a Canadian economy that already has little room to absorb another industrial shock. Manufacturing jobs are difficult to replace because they often pay better than many service sector positions available to workers without advanced degrees. They support apprenticeships, skilled trades, engineering roles, logistic jobs, and entire supplier networks. Once those ecosystems disappear, rebuilding them can take decades. That is why Ottawa's obsession with getting subsidy money back misses the biggest point. Yes, taxpayers deserve protection when companies fail to meet commitments. Yes, governments should recover funds when contracts allow it. But Canadians do not fund these factories because they wanted their check returned 5 years later. They funded them because they wanted plants operating, workers employed, and Canadian manufacturing growing. The government will argue that cheaper EV imports help consumers and that new trade relationships could eventually bring investments into Canada. Maybe they will, but auto workers cannot pay today's mortgage with a factory that might be announced in 5 years from now. They need production assigned to Oshawa, Ingersoll, Windsor, Brampton, and Oakville now. Manufacturing policy is measured in vehicles built, not agreements signed.
Ontario's premier says they'll hear from lawyers.
If they breach a contract, we're going to sue them. Simple as that. And he knows that. They've breached a contract, and we're going to make sure that we get another vehicle in that area.
And there is proof that investment in Canada is still possible. Ford has continued investing in Oakville and announced plans connected to Super Duty truck production, bringing workers back earlier than expected. That matters because it proves Canada auto industry is not automatically doomed. Companies will invest here when the economics make sense. The challenge is creating conditions where Canada consistently wins those decisions instead of celebrating the occasional exception. That is the real message behind GM shutting down production and reducing shifts. Canada is not watching one company abandon every Canadian facility. GM still has substantial investment here, and some Canadian plants remain active, but the trend is dangerous enough without aggravation. Ontario is losing shifts, losing programs, and watching billions of dollars in new automotive investments flow south while governments scramble to respond. Canada's explosion of anger is therefore not really about one GM announcement. It is about a system that promised workers stability in exchange for massive public support and then failed to guarantee the jobs. It is about families watching American plants add workers while Canadian plants cut them. It is about Ottawa threatening companies after their production decisions have already been signed.